Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the JMO podcast. I'm your host, Tayler Michels. This week's guest is Joel Nelson. In my opinion, Joel's one of the best all-around contributors to the fishing industry these days. He's a multi-species guy. He's fished all over the Midwest over the years, hosting some very popular television shows. There's a ton of great Joel Nelson information on YouTube, and he's always coming out with a really great article, helping tons of people learn how to catch more fish all across the Midwest. On this podcast, we talk about targeting big walleyes late summer, early fall, rigging creek chubs. Get your pen and paper out. There's a lot to learn on this week's podcast with Joel Nelson. How you got in the industry and what your position is today.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, thanks for having me on. But I guess it's a logical place to start. I didn't really start in the industry directly or by any wish or want of my own. It was accidental, believe it or not. I'd always been a big outdoors person and loved hunting and loved fishing, and I really, I have an educator's background, and education is kind of in my blood. A lot of teachers in my family, and back in the day where outdoor forums, where online forums were the deal, that was kind of where a lot of people gathered, like-minded people gathered, well before social media, well before Facebook, and that was a place where I kind of hung out and just joined in the conversation. And it just by happenstance, certain people in the industry kind of saw me writing and providing responses, helping people out. And a good friend of mine today, John Marshall, who he runs a rep group and works with Markham and some of these other companies. Way back then, he and I kind of forged a friendship and started just saying, hey, would you like to do more of this? And that was really the beginning of the snowball rolling downhill, where I started just doing online communications, writing responses to people on forums, and eventually started working sport shows and doing things like that. And, that's kind of, really, like I said, snowballed into today, where being an outdoors communicator is really, I feel, my role in the industry. I love writing. I love sharing. There have been a lot of things that I've picked up from people along the way, and it feels good to kind of pass that along. So, doing a lot of the writing, going to the sport shows, doing online video content, those kinds of things. It's a way that's allowed me to make a living in the fishing industry, but it's also been a way for me to kind of address my passions, which is really that education and sharing side of things.
Responding to and blogging and doing all that writing and stuff, that had to come from somewhere. I mean, you weren't just an average Joe. You were fishing a lot, right? I mean, your background in fishing, you're a multi-species guy. So, talk to me about that. Where was that information, that writing, and those responses coming from? I mean, how much fishing were you doing? And talk a little bit about your fishing background.
When I look back on that, I think back to that fishing careers workshop put on by the Linders, and listening to the responses of people like Matt Johnson from Clam and all across the industry. We were always folks that were the most enthusiastic about fishing in our own circle of friends. If my buddies would tell you about me, fishing is going to be one of the first things they'll ever bring up. And that's just because as a kid, I had to take my bike down to the local creek, and if it was chubs, fine. If we were after trout, whatever. Panfish with my grandpa, it didn't matter. Fishing was always involved in the conversation, and I was always interested in the outdoors, and so I got a 4-year degree in natural resources up at a place called Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. So, moving away from kind of the muddy creeks of southern Minnesota and some of the shallow lakes all the way up to Lake Superior was an awakening for me. I mean, I spent time chasing everything from salmon and trout to walleyes in the bay, big smallmouth up in the Chequamegon, and then after that, I worked as a stint in Yellowstone National Park for the Park Service doing something called GIS and mapping. And along the way, I did a little part-time fly guiding, so I did a lot of fly fishing out there. Like I said, it doesn't matter what kind of fishing is available. I'm going to want to do it, and that seems to be wherever I've traveled, wherever I've gone. Fishing is kind of the common thread, and fishing seriously is always the common thread that weaves, kind of what my background is all about.
That's such a great story because it just really kind of turned you into the kind of a jack of all trades, if you will. And I mean that as a compliment. I mean, you're when it comes to the multi-species guys out there, and there's some good ones, I just really enjoy consuming your content. So I'm really glad that you got discovered in an unexpected, unassuming kind of way in this industry, because it has brought us here. And I have sat in on a few of your seminars, and they're excellent. And your teaching background really shows through. You're a great communicator. And I'm going to pick your brain about how to catch big fish in this, but I do follow your social medias and things like that. I know you get out. I know you you take your family out. You're doing a little bit. What's this summer? What are some of the good summer bites that you're out on with your kids and your family?
Yeah. No, I've been fishing quite a bit. When COVID hit, it was kind of during the heart of the early panfish season for me. Fishing was something we were just going to be doing, and it also happened to be, stream trout season. So right below the house here, I live on a trout stream just south of Cannon Falls. I did a lot of that, did a lot of turkey hunting. But as far as the fishing bites are concerned, I really like to follow the pre-spawn kind of bluegill bite moving into the spawn. For them, obviously, is a little bit later, and you get crappies in between. And then crappies after. Right now, I've been fishing a fair amount of crappies just because they're well done with spawning now, probably a month or two beyond that. But they've kind of pushed off of the weed lines, and they're doing a little bit of hovering. You can see them really well in electronics. And so I do a lot of different trolling patterns, and jig trolling is something I'm kind of known for, and that I just really like to do it. It's been a successful tactic and technique for me, but I'm always tweaking. I'm always doing new things. I actually found a bite earlier last week where jigs and soft plastics weren't doing as well as small rattle baits. I found it on accident fishing a rip and wrap for walleyes on a big wind-blown point, and actually had a couple crappies eat the thing, and it was odd, man. I mean, kind of ripping a rip and wrap like a jig and having crappies attack it. I was kind of blown away. Well, it's a muddy, murky system, and so I started trolling those, and that's something I've been doing a little bit more lately. Just trying to explore new bites. Bites I've always been on and always done, but do them in different ways. I guess that keeps me interested and keeps it fun. And I've been doing some walleye trolling too, just some long lining, and now definitely we're getting into lead core season because the fish are deep. So between walleyes and crappies, those are kind of the two more consistent patterns I've been on lately. And it's been fun showing my family those things and learning along the way with my boys. I think that's what makes it fun. If you stop learning, that takes away the interest level for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And no better time in fishing history with all the nuance that we have, the electronics, we're in this technology age of things, and same thing with all the technology that goes into the baits that are made. And so there's so much out there to be learning from. With this COVID, there's, a huge spike in license sales. We've got, there's just a lot of participation in the industry. You talk to the boat dealerships throughout the Midwest, they're having sales at an all-time high. So whether it's people buying boats for the first time or they're upgrading, from a 16-foot aluminum to a 20-foot fiberglass, whatever it is, there's just there's just a lot of participation, sort of, as a byproduct of all this social distancing and turning into all this family time with all the extracurricular stuff canceled. And so you look at the fishing industry, there's probably still a lot of room to teach the basics. There's a lot of people that are getting in a boat and getting out and learning trolling for the first time. I wanted to ask you about walleyes. I want to ask you about big fish, live bait rigging, big baits, chubs, big shiners, this late summer into fall, live bait rigging the bigger baits. And so that's kind of where I wanted to direct this, was kind of the ins and outs, the Joel Nelson version of, live bait rigging these bigger baits. What can you tell me about that? I mean, when you're live bait rigging, what does your setup look like? What do some of these spots look like? How do you find these spots?
Yeah, you bet. Well, live bait rigging big bait is something pretty near and dear to me because, I grew up in an area with lots of little creeks and small rivers in which we can trap chubs. And so that's been something I've done for many years. And, anybody that rigs bigger baits like that will be the first to tell you that it's a big fish technique. I can tell you of a number of times where I've been on different live bait rigging bites up in the Leech Lake area, up in the Longville area in northern Minnesota, where we can catch numbers of fish pulling leeches or crawlers, just about anything. But you rig on a big chub, you may get less bites, and that may be even something you can come to expect. But all of those bites, on average, are going to be bigger and better fish. And so being able to have chubs at ready supply for me to trap and go to fish with, and then being able to go apply those to waters near and far, it's something that if you're after a big one, it's really one of the best of the best. And I've got an interesting perspective on it because I do fish in northern Minnesota a fair amount. I've never had an issue traveling to fish. I'll do it at a moment's notice. But I've also got the Mississippi River and Lake Pepin area nearby where live bait rigging is a totally different deal, even for bigger chubs or baits like willow cats, which probably aren't very common to a lot of listeners. But willow cats are a big fish bait that's used down on the river along the Mississippi, and have been since the beginning of time, I'm sure, because they flat out catch fish. And you're not always rigging deep in the river. In fact, quite often you're rigging shallow or current break areas, and those are the kind of spots where you can have great big fish. There was a tournament this summer that was recently won doing a lot of that. And so if I'm on the river, it tends to be shallower spots. They tend to be current breaks, even off of the main channel. Definitely areas where other rivers or other streams come in, and kind of the deep lip of those input areas, those tributaries that come in. You couldn't pick a more classic walleye spot to rig large live bait, because big fish simply move up in and out of those creeks, and you've basically got almost like a bottleneck, like you're deer hunting. It's like it's a spot those fish are going to move through, any of those little cuts, any of those tributaries moving up and in. So that's what I'm doing down on the river. But when I'm fishing natural lakes, you're talking depths in excess of 20 feet of water almost always. I'm always thinking about areas where those big fish can go up and roam shallower in the evening. A lot of times you get into August and September, a lot of those fish, they'll either roam shallows or they'll go up and feed, just below the surface or at least in open water. So those deep fish do move around a lot. It's just that during the day or early mornings or evenings when you're targeting them, most often you're talking 20, 25 feet of water. I think of deep rock ledges. Most of my best deep rigging spots on natural lakes in northern Minnesota are deep rock. And almost always they have nearby access to some of the deepest water in the lake. So I'm thinking, in the 25-foot range. I don't like to fish things 30, 35 feet, even though I know walleyes are there and I can see them. Once you're after big fish, and big fish primarily, you take them out of 35-plus feet of water, more than likely they're going to die. So for me anyway, it's a game where I'm looking for fish on good rock ledges, deep with access to even deeper water, but trying to catch them early morning or late evening hours in those deep spots with big minnows. So that's kind of the way I like to go about it. But fall is dynamic, so it's one of those times and things where you got to trust your electronics. Down imaging has been really great in that deep water. You can look at standard sonar and sometimes miss fish, but having the down imaging screen right next to it, if I'm deep rigging chubs, I do a lot of searching and a lot of looking, and especially with down imaging, and then I start to deploy my setup after I feel like I understand what's going on below me.
So what does your setup look like? I mean, how picky are you with your setup? I mean, when you look at the different setups and different ways to go about it, what does your setup look like?
A lot of my big bait rigging was born on the river, and so I'm not too picky with my setup in terms of the terminal tackle and all that. We can get into that eventually, but when it comes to rods, I am very particular when it comes to that, mostly because whether it be willow cats or hell, whether I'm talking about flathead catfish and putting a big bullhead on the line, big baits get in the way of hooks and hook sets, and there's no two ways around that. So light rods with slow actions or even medium, moderate to fast actions aren't going to get it done. And so I'm fishing almost always a longer rod, 7 foot, 7.5 foot region. Medium would be the lightest power I would go. Uh, and as far as actions, I really like a fast, extra fast action because it gets to backbone quickly. I want to feel that fish, and I want to feel exactly everything that it's doing. When a walleye hits, especially a big walleye, some of those big baits, they crush it. But it's not like a bass hit. A lot of times they come in and just smash it. It's almost like when you can almost feel like them pulverizing it in their mouth, and I don't know how else to explain it other than they come up and smack it, and that bait immediately stops kicking. And you can feel them kind of mashing it up, and sometimes they take off with it. Most often they sit there and chew on it a little bit, and then there comes a point where they're going to make away with that meal, and you need to look at setting that hook. And more often than not, you're trying to set the hook through a whole bunch of meat, and you really need to not necessarily cross their eyes on the hook set, but certainly you've got to take up the slack. You've got to remove the boomerang effect that you got going on with your big egg sinker or whatever kind of sinker you've got. And you really need a long sweeping hook set, and you need to continue with the reel. Keep coming, because even a big fish with a heavier rod, you can move him forward on the hook set, and then so many anglers dip that rod right after, kind of point it, and they provide too much slack, and maybe they didn't put a good hook through all that meat, all that bait that you got back there, and so many fish get away. After you pull a fish forward, you drop the rod back, you go to pull up more line, and he's gone. Nothing's there. So, rods and using the proper rod, a long enough rod, a big sweeping hook set, and following up on the reeling, that's all part of the rod game and making sure you hook up those fish.
And how picky are you with your line? I mean, I like braid, right? So, I'll have my main line of braid, a 10 to 12 pound braid or more, depending upon. And then, but, you talk about these, these lakes, these deep, clear lakes. I mean, how long of a leader, what kind of leader material do you like? Swivel, how are you weighting down that minnow? Because a lot of times them chubs, that big bait can swim around. Maybe kind of go through that progression and how you like to do yours, because I know there's a lot of different opinions out there and people have different, tips and tactics for that. So what's your version?
Again, product of your environment. On the river, I don't have a problem going all braid, and I'm just like you. I like running braid, the feel, the sensitivity, being able to feel that minnow flick kick. It certainly is a little bit harder to get a feel for a minnow pickup than is sometimes on a leech, because the leech, you don't feel the leech moving around. With a minnow, you have to discern the difference between the minnow moving and you getting bit, right? So I tend to fish with a little bit heavier braid, like you're talking about, at least 10 pound, usually a little heavier. And then I've got a swivel. And if I'm fishing dark, murky water environments or the river, and there's a lot of snags and there's a lot of problems, I'll go 10, 12 pound fluorocarbon. If I've got a lot of zebra mussel issues, I will go straight braid, straight to the hook. Straight braid with a swivel, maybe 3 foot up. I don't like a very long lead in the river. Current is there to kind of fix you, but you get a real long lead, those minnows can get up into junk in places you don't want them to go. And so I don't like a lead much longer than 3 foot on the river. In a standard lake situation, even in rocks, I'll go up to 6 foot with a 10 to 12 pound fluorocarbon leader, braid main line. I'm not as particular. I'm not maybe the best minnow rigging mind when it comes to doing it in finesse, super clear water environments where walleyes are ultra fussy. And maybe that's just because my theory is that with a big bait like that, they either look at it and love it, or they're not going to touch it. And most often, the reaction, if you put it near enough to them, it's predatory, it's quick, it's aggressive. They don't pay much mind to line and a lot of the hardware side of things, in my mind, from what I've seen. When I think of trying to keep that minnow down and ways to keep that minnow from swimming around too much, a lot of times, like I said, in river current situations, the current takes care of some of that for you. And when you don't have current in a natural lake situation, I'll actually pull minnows a little faster than one might consider to rig them. And again, that keeps that minnow from roaming a little bit too far off to the sides, or especially up. That's the big worry, is that you give that fish 6 foot of line, that fish is going to ride, as much as 6 foot off a bottom. You don't want your bait 6 foot off a bottom, obviously. Pulling that thing along at a little better clip, maybe if you're used to rigging at 0.4, 0.5, maybe pulling at 0.7, 0.8, even up to a mile an hour, if you have fish scattered, isn't always a bad idea. Now, if you're pinpoint fishing, right, if you got just a pod of them that you're trying to drag through, well, obviously you can't pull at that speed. So you can always use a slightly shorter leader length to keep that, that minnow down and keep it from trying to stay away from all the fish. But usually a big chub freaking out overhead, even 3 foot up, a good walleye that wants it's going to come up and eat it. So I don't mess around with getting too technical on that end of things. If chubs aren't going, or I'm having a hard time making that whole thing work, well, I can always drop a jig on them, or you get towards the fall, a jig and wrap in that same area might be the ticket. But when the chub bite is going and going strong, because those fish come up and absolutely mash it. They're usually very, very into it, and it's one of my favorites just because it tends to produce big fish. And for leech, all those years, all those big tournaments anywhere near the fall, you just had to be rigging big chubs to win it. So there's definitely something to it. And if people don't know how to do it, I think the best way to go out there and do it is to just literally get a pile of chubs and force yourself to fish in that method only. You'd be amazed what locking down and just saying, yep, today I'm going to learn how to fish a chub better will do for you. And that goes for any technique. So if you don't know much about it, just go out and buy a bunch of chubs, go out and trap your own, and just take a day and say, this is what I'm going to do today. Don't be tempted to go to the other types of ways you think you can catch fish. Force yourself to do it. I think that'll make you a more well-rounded angler.
The JMO podcast is sponsored by Long Haul Trucking. Long Haul's always looking for more skilled professional CDL drivers to join their team. They're a people-first company, and it shows. Their employee-owned, asset-based fleet of over 350 Conestogas is among industry leaders in pay and benefits geared towards long-term success and growth for company drivers and owner-operators. If you're a professional driver or a company that wants to ship product with the best in the business, get a hold of Long Haul at 1-800-255-5153 or find them online at longhaultrucking.com. Long Haul, running on the power of promises kept. I think that is super great advice. As far as my experience, I've never gone out and known exactly the method that I was going to do that day, and it ended up being the absolute best, and I did it all day long. You always got to be ready for a 1-2 punch, and you really touched on it there where, if you can run them chubs, just a little bit faster, try to get on the high end of that speed, and just cover a little bit of water. And if you got a couple pods of fish there, one might be a little more active than the other, and be ready to switch up. And there is kind of that, there's always a 1-2 punch to just about every method. There's a yin and a yang. So when it comes to rigging chubs, is that usually what you start out with, or is it a method that sometimes you've resorted to?
That's a good question. I think of it as a middle technique, maybe middle to finesse type technique. So often my best chub rigging days are after I have fished other methods and gotten a feel for the body of water I'm on. Hey, pull out chubs on day 2 or day 3. That's when I really feel like I can make some hay, because a lot of times that time of year I'm still trying to pull lead core on those fish. I'll fish lead core well into the fall. If the fish are there, on a big system especially, I know of no better way to cover water and put baits in more fish's faces, just because with that lead core, you're running it right in front of their nose. As long as you got your depths figured out and your dive curves taken care of, you're putting baits in front of fish. Now, where the chub rigging comes in is after you've got a milk run, or you've laid down some spots where you've got a couple active pods of fish, either slightly scattered, moderately scattered throughout an area, or you've got them real tightly locked into some pods. That's when going back with some big chubs and taking out the biggest, the leaders of the pack. That's where that technique to me makes the most sense. And it's also nice because chubs are a little bit of a pain. You got to do some prepping. You got to either buy the bait or you got to trap it and have it ready. You got to take care of them. You got to keep them cool. Chubs really soil the water, man. So it's almost like you can't have a big enough bait container for them. If you got a couple dozen chubs, they will poop up that water in like 4 to 6 hours. So you might even change water as often as twice daily, but at least once daily. So you kind of got to have this preconceived notion that you're going to fish some chubs going into it. That said, I just don't like heading out onto the water and, scanning with the graph for an hour and saying, hey, I think I got a spot to drop chubs on. I love breaking them things out after I've got a little bit more time on that same body of water over a couple of days. That's when I really feel like I can, do the best for that technique.
A lot of people that have familiarity with rigging, just Lindy rigging leeches, rigging just a slightly bigger bait or, just a bigger bait is easy to grasp, mentally or just strategically. But that being said, with your advice there on how you like to kind of cover water, maybe with some lead core or some other nuanced methods, there's probably a few steps that people are skipping there that might be leaving a few fish on the table. So I think that's really good advice.
One more thing I was going to bring up with chubs is you're going to lose some bait when you're starting out with this deal, and don't fret. At first, it's going to be a little bit expensive just in terms of losing some bait. You're going to feel certain things that might feel like a fish that weren't. You're going to load up. You're going to set the hook too hard. You're going to rip hooks. Or you're going to have I think of like Mille Lacs or leech or areas where there's a lot of fish per acre. You're going to get some smaller fish that'll latch onto these things and strip them off hooks. And you're also going to have these situations where fish will eat it and eat it well, but you're still trying to figure out your way through the hook set. I'll never forget, I talked to Tony Roach a couple of years ago, and he was on a guide trip in the fall where, they were rigging chubs, and he just had clients that were going through such volumes of bait because they had to learn kind of the deal, right? They had to figure out what they were feeling, and he was having to actively teach them. And it gets to be an expensive day in that regard, but if you're an angler on your own trying to figure this thing out, don't fret if you're going through bait. Don't fret if you're missing fish. It's all part of the process. You're going to get better at the feel and expect to fail at first, but that's a necessary step to getting better at the whole technique.
A lot of chub rigging is a deeper, these deeper, clear, natural lakes. But that being said, you look at these diverse bodies of water like Mille Lacs and some of that stuff. There's almost always a shallow pattern going on. Is there any nuance to rigging chubs shallow?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not a lot of folks do it, mostly because by the time you get to summer, a lot of people don't give credit to how shallow walleyes will go. But if you talk to anybody who fishes Mille Lacs, especially if they fish for smallmouth, they'll tell you story after story of big walleyes that they're smacking. I talked to James Linder here a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about how Ned rigging could be the number one technique for catching walleyes when not trying to catch walleyes that you could ever imagine well into the summer. And they're fishing that thing in like 2 to 7 foot of water, and these walleyes are absolutely crushing it. So when it comes to trying to select for bigger walleyes while rigging chubs and doing it shallow, the biggest thing you got to be concerning yourself with is your boat. And, on a clear body of water like Mille Lacs, I've never tried it, mostly because I think it would be really tough to drive over fish and then drag a bait behind you and have any feel whatsoever. I mean, if it's a trolling situation, a lot of people get around that either with planer boards or they get around it with just having huge amounts of line out back behind the boat while long line trolling or something to that effect. Now, where it comes into play, however, on shallow side of things, is where you've got a really well-defined cabbage line, especially interior cabbage bed or part of the cabbage bed. In that situation, the cabbage stalks, a little bit of wind, a little bit of clouds. Definitely, I have caught fish rigging chubs on the inside part of those cabbage beds While most anglers are traditionally going to try the deep side of them, the insides will hold fish as well. In areas where there's a lot of bass, though, you'd be amazed, man. Smallmouth love, and largemouth do too. So sometimes you're chased off of the inside weed line just on account of the bass really love that sucker, right? And
Oh yeah.
On some of the bigger walleye lakes, you can stay to the outside and not always be bass free, but maybe a little more so than the inside. But if you're a tournament guy and you're looking for those big bites, leave no weed stock or stone unturned, right? I mean, I'd be checking the inside too, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And just to reiterate the point, I mean, in a lot of those scenarios, you'd be catching a lot more fish, a lot more, maybe smaller fish in those good fertile areas using other techniques. But it's rigging these chubs is a big fish technique. So you got to think outside the box. You got to try some stuff that, is definitely going to seem a little unconventional at times when you're looking at a spot and you're trying to decide, like you say, there's, that weed, there's a little bit of a peak, a point, or, there's just some sort of an abnormality. We better go try that, and that's just where some of these great nuances are born. You're talking about the crappies on that rip and wrap, like isn't that the thing? That's the hook, right? Like that's why we do what we do, and we try weird stuff, and because we might catch that one fish that just hasn't seen a bait before because nobody dared to go up there.
Well, and those kinds of things, I go back to that crappie bite and why that really struck a chord with me. It's because the previous day I was jig trolling and the fish were there, man. I mean, like on side imaging, I could see pods. I'd mark them. I'd drive over them. And normally I'm expecting those fish to go. And they just weren't. And then you stack up a technique that's totally off the wall, totally unorthodox, and pull those completely wild or different baits through the same area and double up and get bit back to back. You're like, wow, so there's something to this, right? It's not just me being weird and trying to catch fish in a totally odd way. Those fish prefer that technique on that day in that place over what traditionally works for me. And then your brain starts turning why, how? And so, yeah, to your point, if you can't turn or pivot on a dime and try and figure those things out, it's going to handicap you as an angler. So you always got to be willing to do things a little bit different, if for fun, if for nothing else, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Talking fishing is always fun. Just the idea of it. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. What would be a good closer? What's some stuff that you've been talking about lately? What are some good points that you got going on lately for yourself that we could close out on?
It's one of those things with the COVID thing that's going on. I've been talking a lot about fishing close to home and rediscovering old water, making it new again. And when COVID hit and everything that was going on here in Minnesota, and how I'm an hour from the Twin Cities. So in certain areas it was pretty bad, and they were not recommending travel too far from home. And not only that, but a lot of the fishing industry gigs that I would have otherwise had were canceled. So even though I'm very used to traveling and going long distances, it was really fun this spring to take bodies of water that I had previously written off and say, why not go at those again with a different mindset, right? Maybe not even for the same species. Maybe if I was used to this being a crappie and bluegill lake, maybe I tried to see what the bass population was like. And there's a couple local lakes here within an hour away that I spent some more time in down by the Faribault area. And I was amazed at the pressure, yet I was also amazed at the quality of fishing in a lot of them. It was hard to get away from people, but it was also, I won't say easy, it was also rewarding, though, to find as many fish as we did. We found some great bluegill action, some pre-spawn bluegill action in the shallows. We found some great big crappies. And, I think so often people are convinced that to catch a big walleye or to catch a big crappie, they need to drive 6 hours. That isn't always the case. There's a lot of really good fishing that can happen close to home. Sometimes you just need to come at it from a different perspective or have the need to fish it and I was happy to do that this spring.
Is there gonna be some great ideas that come out of this era? The summer of 2020 being the big train wreck that it is, globally, in terms of the pandemic. Is the fishing industry? Are there going to be some things coming out into the fishing industry from this time? Just because people are getting out and people are fishing and people are getting back to the basics. I mean, is there going to be some enlightenment here? What are your thoughts on that?
I think absolutely. There have been a lot of silver linings as a part of everything that's gone on during the summer. And number one is people are fishing and fishing a lot. You talk about anybody who sells tackle, and they'll tell you what it's been like recently. And you'll also look in past years in recessions and down years, people still fish. They just buy more terminal tackle. They buy more of the basics, So I think that's definitely followed in the bait stores and retailers that I frequent. So I think that's definitely a good thing. The bad side of it, there's a flip side to every coin, is that, I live along a trout stream, and we've had so many trespass issues. At boat ramps, I've seen a lot of discourteous anglers, and half of them, I'm sure they don't know they're being discourteous because it's probably brand new to them. But so I'm seeing some negative sides of that where people are literally parking in ways that prevent, that fill up boat ramps quicker because they're not accustomed to doing things maybe the proper way. So between trespass and some of the things I've seen at local landings, there is a downside to that. But I can tell you, as far as the industry goes and all the people that are fishing, innovation is not stopping. I know of several companies that are pushing right through this and coming out with brand new tackle offerings, brand new gear options and equipment. And I see people out there fishing as fervently as ever, as geeked up as ever to wet a line. So, yeah, I don't think that COVID has slowed that down. If anything, it's accelerated that pace.
And you're right. There's going to be some really popular or community boat landings that are going to have a bit of a struggle. But for the veterans that are out there, the fishermen that are out there day in and day out and are struggling with all this new participation, we all have to turn into ambassadors. We all have to help each other out. Maybe go over there and, instead of getting in a confrontation, maybe help that guy out, and we can teach each other. And then, just as an industry, we can help ourselves evolve a little bit. But you're right. When we get all that participation, that the floodgates open up, or, there's a lot of people that have fished for a long time, but maybe they got a nicer boat this year just because of all the time they had to go fish. And, it's kind of their first time functioning at a boat ramp on a regular basis. If we, hopefully we can all kind of get through it, and, we're all ambassadors at a boat ramp, good or bad. And everybody that's, got stories, about being at a boat ramp and seeing some ridiculous things. But
I agree completely. Lending a helping hand to an angler that you can, if you fish seriously at all, you'll notice that person right away because they're just not accustomed to doing it. And I had my oldest son, Isaac, who's 15, help a guy with a dock line here the other day, and he really needed it. And you know what? It was great to see him pitch in and do that for that other guy because, he was struggling a little bit, and I can't agree more. Like you said, we're all ambassadors. We can just help each other out at these ramp situations. I think that's super important. And I even down to the trespass issue. I ran into folks that were trespassing on our land this spring that just didn't know any better. And some of them were playing dumb, I'm sure. But I feel very sincerely that some of them just didn't have an idea, didn't have a clue. And if they're first-time participants of the sport, the last thing I want to do is, kick them off, give them a big ticket, and make them never want to fish again. So I think it's important, no matter what perspective we're looking at it from, like you said, to help people out. If you can help them, well, maybe the next time their next experience at the boat ramp is good. I can tell you there's been some T-shirts I've seen lately. I was going to show my wife. One of them says, I'm sorry for what I said while we were docking the boat.
Yeah.
It's super funny, but it's a universal experience, right? If you've launched the boat with a loved one, you know that things can get a little heated. And I I think of where does that stress come from? But for me, it comes from literally almost trying to be too courteous. I want to race in, dump my boat in, get it out of there, and get it out of the way of other people as quickly as possible, because I don't like being inconvenienced at a boat ramp. I don't want to be the person that does it to somebody else, and sometimes it comes at the expense of getting a little too heated.
Get a little heated,
but,
yeah. Because sometimes you don't necessarily have to lend a helping hand. Just realize that people are watching. If you just do a good job putting your boat in,
yeah,
that's all you need to do, because there's 10 sets of eyeballs that saw you do something really efficiently. You had all your ducks in a row. Everything was loaded in the boat before you got there, and you knew right where you were gonna go, and you kind of had the setup. And people see that, and you don't need to necessarily contact those people. You don't need to talk to them or show them, or do it for them. But man, when they see you do it right, that in itself can just be the nugget, and you don't even know when it's happening. But you're right. That is super funny. I know. Yeah, my wife. Yeah, she would get one heck of a laugh out of a shirt like that. I can guarantee you. Guaranteed.
We've all been there, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, for sure. Anyways, well, I tell you what, Joel, this is that is such a great way to wrap it up. So how about, give me maybe your social medias. Where can people find you and some of your content?
Yeah, you bet. I've got a lot of things coming up here as we get deeper into summer. I'm going to be doing a lot of river fishing. I kind of feel like it's fish in a barrel a little bit. As water levels recede, I'll be doing a lot of that. And I've got a couple other projects coming up where we might have some video efforts, and all that's going to be linked to my social channels. So I'm at Joel Nelson Outdoors, whether you're talking Twitter, Instagram, Facebook is facebook.com/Joel Nelson Outdoors. And then a lot of that writing or video or other content originates from my website, www.joelnelsonoutdoors.com. So however you get at me, feel free to drop a line. I love helping. I respond to every single bit of communications that I can. And, I view it as my job to share some of the knowledge that people have been gracious enough to pass along to me. So check me out, and look forward to hearing from you.
Perfect. All right, Joel. We'll talk to you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Taylor.
Thank you, everybody, for following along on another episode of the podcast. Make sure to head over to our social medias on Instagram or Facebook at Jason Mitchell Outdoors, where you can recommend a guest or a topic for an upcoming show. If you're tuning in on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts, make sure to hit the subscribe button and share with all your friends.